Khan, and I'm so pleased to be joined by so many advocates today and calling on New Yorkers to submit comments in response to the POST Act, the Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology Act. We'll be going through and I will post the run of show into the chat for everyone's reference. We will have about 2 to 3 minutes per speaker, and then we will transition into Q&A for members of the press. If you have questions, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And thank you again for joining us today. The POST Act represented a unique opportunity to have the NYPD pull back the curtain on how it has been spying on New Yorkers for years. The NYPD fought this and they lost. They fought it at the city council and they lost. They even went and claimed that this would undermine public safety. And New Yorkers said they were wrong. But now the NYPD is trying to rewrite a law by that it simply was unable to block. And it's doing this by ignoring its clear requirements. The NYPD is required to tell us the tools it's using. It's required to tell us what systems are being used to monitor New Yorkers every day. But instead, it has tried to rewrite history. It has tried to whitewash reality, and it has tried to hide the truth. And now New Yorkers have just a few days left in order to actually address the ways that these surveillance systems are undermining public safety and putting New Yorkers at risk. The NYPD has claimed that systems like facial recognition and its gang database are non-biased, that they don't have a disparate impact, but we know this is false. We know that New Yorkers of color make up 99% of those in the gang database. We know that facial recognition is biased and broken against communities of color. We know these systems are putting New Yorkers in harm's way, and the NYPD has responded with lies instead of real reforms. The NYPD asked for trust. They asked to have the opportunity to oversee this transparency process. And they've shown that they cannot be trusted with the tools that they already have. The NYPD has shown that they cannot be trusted with systems like facial recognition and systems like the gang database. And so we urge New Yorkers in the time they have left between now and February 25th to make their voices heard, to submit comments to the NYPD and tell the police department to ban facial recognition, tell it to end the gang database, and tell it that we need real policies that will end the sorts of discriminatory surveillance practices that have defined New York's policing for generations. Right now is a unique opportunity, because if the NYPD ignores the comments that are being submitted, if they ignore the facts on the ground, it will create a new way to put pressure on the department. It will give us a new chance to pursue changes, both at the city council and in court. This is an important chance, and we have just a few hours left. So for New Yorkers who want to have their voice heard, who want to speak up against NYPD abuses, please go to postact.org and submit your comments. As it stands, if New Yorkers do not act out, if we do not speak up, then it will only be a rubber stamp for the sort of abuses we have seen for years. Thankfully, we know that thousands of New Yorkers have already submitted comments. Thousands of New Yorkers have already said that these policies are wrong. And thousands of New Yorkers are joining us today in calling for the NYPD to end facial recognition, to eliminate the gang database, and to implement the POST Act. Thank you very much. With that, I will turn over to our next speaker, Angel Diaz of the Brennan Center for Justice.
Thanks, Albert. The NYPD is the largest police department in the country with the largest arsenal of surveillance technologies, and we had a unique opportunity to have meaningful oversight over the use of these technologies. Unfortunately, these policies universally fail to comply with the requirements of the POST Act. They don't meaningfully engage with the civil rights and civil liberties risks that are raised by technologies that are blanketing all of New York City, but are particularly being used to target Black and Brown communities. We know, for example, that the New York City Police Department used facial recognition to target a protester over the summer. We know that they regularly use it to go after people that are doing something as simple as stealing a 6-pack of beer or a package from someone's doorstep. We know, for example, that the NYPD gang database is overwhelmingly Black or Latino, and that a lot of people's may be added for making an assertion on social media, someone that may be a child or a teenager that doesn't know that what they say on social media may end up being misconstrued by an NYPD officer. Despite all these things, the NYPD's disclosures say that their tools aren't biased or that they have a human in the loop for facial recognition. They don't mention that that human can also run Photoshop art experiments on people's pictures and resubmit that through facial recognition. They don't mention that that human in the loop can also just decide that a suspect looks like a given celebrity and run that photo through facial recognition. Things that we have seen the NYPD train their employees to do. The reality is that these tools, these policies all fail to comply, and New Yorkers need to demand more. We need to know specifically which tools are being used, specifically which agencies are receiving data from NYPD surveillance tools. We need to specifically know what steps are being taken to address known disparate impacts on communities of color. If the NYPD can't be trusted to engage in basic inventories and disclosures, why should they have these tools at all? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Angel. Next, we will be hearing from Jerome Greco from the Legal Aid Society.
Thank you, Albert, and everyone here today. The Post Act requires the NYPD to issue and abide by impacting use policies for all its different surveillance tools, obtaining the bare minimum from an agency long known for its opaqueness and secrecy. Unfortunately, the NYPD has continued its tradition of faux accountability and faux transparency by pretending to be compliant with the requirements. The reality is that the 36 draft policies they released are insufficient, inaccurate, and fail to provide the transparency the Post Act sought to achieve. We do not have time today to discuss all the issues, but I'll briefly mention a few here. I'll also be submitting much more detailed public comments soon. The NYPD claims that its information is not shared in furtherance of immigration enforcement, but the draft policies do not properly explain the measures, if any, that the NYPD is taking to prevent the access it gives to federal authorities from being used as part of immigration enforcement. Copying and pasting a boilerplate statement to all the policies does not make it true, nor does it inspire confidence that the proper safeguards are in effect. The NYPD makes vague claims that they follow all applicable laws when using their surveillance, but mostly fail to specify those laws and how their use stays within their bounds. They have a long history of abusing surveillance, often claiming they had the legal authority. This pattern of misuse has shown that the public cannot trust the NYPD to come to their own conclusions about what are lawful and unlawful uses of technology. Additionally, throughout the draft policies, the NYPD does not specify the name of vendors, device models, or software versions. This is intentional. If we were to have that information, it may reveal the true capabilities of many of these tools, contradicting the public statements the NYPD has made both in these policies and beyond. Even some of the information we already knew to be true is contradicted in draft policies. One example is the NYPD denies that facial recognition and ShotSpotter use artificial intelligence, which ignores the way these technologies work. Another example is that they claim the gang database does not have a disparate impact on people of color. Negative impacts include, but are not limited to, using entries in the gang database that justify large-scale military-style raids of people's homes and increased harassment from police. Frankly, transparency is a low bar for a public agency, but the NYPD has still chosen to crawl under it. We encourage the public to submit their comments and demand more from the NYPD before the comment period ends on February 25th. Time is running out, and it's important that we do not accept these policies as they are written. We do not accept this as actual compliance.
Thank you so much, Jerome. Next, we will be hearing from Erica Johnson of the National Lawyers Guild.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I just want to say that now is the time for change. Now is the time to act. If you were protesting in the streets, but you don't act on policies that affect your local neighborhood, you haven't finished your job. Yes, being an advocate or activist is a job that is high risk, but with great rewards. We brought change to the White House, but now we need to bring change to your house. What the NYPD is doing is happening in your house, your neighborhood, and your community. We need to let them know that you control your house. We need you to stand up and take action on the local policies happening in your neighborhood every day. You deserve to have police be accountable for the actions that are happening to Black and brown people across the nation, but specifically in your house, right in your backyard in New York City. The last period for you to comment on the Post Act to make sure that we have the policies in place that actually offer you the protections and the services that you deserve is February 25th. So I urge you to make those comments, to show up at their offices, make sure you understand the issues that are being asked here, and then also make your voice be heard. Like protesting, the work that you were doing in the streets over George Floyd in the summer, the work isn't done. It's not done yet until we get all of the protections and the rights that we are fighting for. So I urge you to make all the comments that you need to make by February 25th, and don't let it stop there. Keep going. Find all the bills that are related to the Black and brown community, not just the Post Act, but all of them. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Erica. Next, we'll be hearing from Michael Sazitsky of NYCLU.
Thanks, Albert. So from the day the Post Act was first introduced to the day it was passed, the NYPD has always voiced loud, hyperbolic objections to it. And now here we are, after the law has taken effect, with the NYPD having been required to disclose their existing surveillance infrastructure. And the one thing that's abundantly clear after reviewing these policies is how much contempt the NYPD still has for the Post Act's mandate for basic transparency. These policies are a far cry from what advocates and lawmakers who supported the Post Act envisioned. Rather than engage meaningfully and individually with each technology, entire sections are copied and pasted from one policy to the next. Stock language proclaims that the NYPD only contracts with approved vendors, but tells us nothing about who those vendors are, nor do they reveal the number, specific models, or total costs of the devices that are actually being acquired and deployed against New Yorkers. And many of these policies, as you've heard, are just flat out inaccurate. They claim that face recognition and ShotSpotter don't use artificial intelligence or machine learning. Someone at the NYPD might want to ask ShotSpotter about that. The company's website explicitly describes those capabilities. They claim that digital forensic access tools don't hack into phones, despite the fact that it's been widely reported that the NYPD has used a tool called Celebrite to do precisely that. If the NYPD is being this dishonest about technology we already know about, what does that suggest about how forthcoming they've been about tools that have been entirely secret? Most glaring in all of this is the department's assessment of the potential disparate impacts of its surveillance practices. The gang database policy doesn't even acknowledge the basic fact that nearly 99% of the people in that database are people of color, and their dismissal of the consequences as being nothing more than an investigative lead fails to reckon with the fact that those leads can generate actual enforcement action. It's a problem throughout these policies. They don't grapple with how surveillance technologies are deployed and used in practice. You can't simply say that gunshot detection systems aren't biased because they only listen for gunshots if you're disproportionately installing them in communities of color and sending police responses there. You can't say that license plate readers aren't biased because they just take pictures of license plates if you're deploying those readers outside of mosques. Instead of taking the opportunity to prove that the NYPD is as committed as they say to transparency and working with communities, they defaulted to their rejection of democratic accountability. They owe the public much more than what these policies delivered. They must, of course, issue revised policies that account for public feedback and correct these flaws. But city lawmakers and state lawmakers should also be watching this process closely. The Post Act was always just the first step in taking on the NYPD's opaque and unaccountable surveillance practices. And if they can't be trusted to fulfill the simplest of transparency mandates, then we need to reassess why they're being trusted to use these tools in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Next, we will have Keturah Tops from the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund.
Thank you, Albert. This is Keturah Tops, Policy Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. As been noted before, the Post Act requires the NYPD to comply with a number of things, particularly to address the disparate impact of its surveillance tools. Rather than doing so, these policies largely simply recite civil rights laws and anti-discrimination policy without any meaningful application of these laws or policies to the NYPD's use of these surveillance technologies. Unfortunately, the policies largely include boilerplate and vague language, such as, quote, the NYPD prohibits the use of racial and bias-based enforcement actions, end quote. The policies include no meaningful analysis on how racial bias and discrimination are evaluated or how the department ensures that they do not result from its extensive surveillance tools. In fact, with the NYPD's current policies, it is nearly impossible for the public to understand the extent of the department's vast surveillance tools or critically the racial justice impacts of its surveillance systems. Quite frankly, this is unacceptable. We already know that even facially neutral technology can and has had a racially disparate impact, but this is particularly true when it's in the hands of the department. Yet the policies failed to address even the widely documented instances of technology facilitated bias and its disproportionate targeting of communities of color. For example, as we've noted multiple times, the criminal group database policy, which addresses its gang database, fails to address the reality that over 98% of individuals on the database are non-white, particularly with 66% individuals being Black and 31% Latinx communities. And this is just one example. The NYPD's refusal to address racial demographic data or racial justice impacts of its technologies is a common theme across all its policies, including its policies addressing facial recognition, social media monitoring, unmanned aircraft systems, and many more. These just name a few. We are pushing the NYPD to update its policies to adhere to the Post-Act's basic requirements. This means including a meaningful assessment of the disparate impact that its tools have on protected classes. And this means requiring a racial justice analysis and assessment of the impact that these technologies have on communities most affected by the NYPD's surveillance and technologies. But to be clear, more is needed. Compliance with the Post-Act is merely the first step in ensuring racial equity and transparency across the department. Accordingly, we call on the public to condemn the NYPD's policies, to respond to the February 25th deadline period, to make sure that your voice is heard, to submit your comments to require the NYPD to at least adhere to the Post-Act's requirements, and then to go further where it is needed. For example, LDF is calling for the elimination of the NYPD's gang database and banning of all facial recognition technology in the hands of the department. We encourage you to do the same. We'll submit detailed comments on our website and look forward to your feedback as well.
Thank you so much, Keturah. Next, we will be hearing from Matt Mahmoudi of Amnesty International.
Thank you, Albert, and thank you to colleagues who've come here today to support this move. We have until February 25th to submit opposition to the New York Police Department's woefully unacceptable and dangerous facial recognition policy. The only acceptable facial recognition policy is a ban, not least because of the policy falling short on a number of different angles, including, as colleagues have mentioned, completely ignoring the racial bias angle of facial recognition technologies, how Black and brown bodies are 65 to 95% more likely to be misidentified, how it falsely claims that AI and machine learning does not constitute facial recognition, the celebration of the problematic use of facial recognition for predictive policing and public health, to mention a few. We and our friends in the coalition here have said this before. Even when it works, facial recognition can exacerbate discriminatory policing and prevent the free and safe exercise of the right to protest through the chilling effect. The ability to go out and protest knowing that there are a number of different devices that can pick up your face for having done no wrongdoing whatsoever is itself a deterrent from exercising your right to protest. That it is by design, facial recognition technologies, that is a technology of mass surveillance and antithetical to human rights. As we've already seen in cases of Black and brown New Yorkers who have been targeted potentially by facial recognition technologies, and the fear that have been expressed in this press conference as well before that facial recognition is ostensibly used in context of protest in particular. And that's why Amnesty International stands with coalition partners here today to ask New Yorkers to oppose the NYPD's facial recognition policy by submitting a post-act comment. We still have 2 days to go on this, folks, and let's make this count. It's not the time for us to wait till individuals are wrongfully arrested. unduly surveilled en masse and virtually lined up and used as experimental sites for potentially racist, invasive, and violent technologies. Before we question this technology, it must be banned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Next, we are going to be hearing from Jose Chapa from the Immigrant Defense Project.
Thank you. Thank you, Albert. Good morning. My name is Jose Chapa, and I'm the Senior Policy Associate at the Immigrant Defense Project based in New York City. IDP works to combat criminalization, including protecting the rights of immigrants who have contact with the police and the criminal legal system. It is urgent that community members submit comments before February 25th because the NYPD has not provided sufficient information about what surveillance technologies it uses as required under the S.T.O.P Act. The NYPD denies that any of their technology enables immigration policing, but there is sufficient information to confirm this. Over the past couple of decades, Immigrant and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE, has invested significantly in expanding its ability to survey, arrest, and deport people. This has included sharing information and technology with police, including biometrics such as fingerprints and potentially facial recognition data. At risk of losing the most of communities of color, more notably Black and Brown communities, including immigrants. The NYPD claims that facial recognition and the gang database do not discriminate, but we know this is not true. In 2018, during a testimony to New York City Council, New York City detectives confirmed that 99% of the New York City gang database was made up of people of color. Being listed on gang databases can have disastrous consequences for people who are either in the process of applying for any immigration relief or are in danger of deportation. When agencies share data without any oversight, such as gang databases, the data is not only exploited, it also leads to multiple erroneous reports of people that have been mistakenly identified as being affiliated with gangs through the blanket-style surveillance of Black and Brown communities. In addition, we can be assured that facial recognition data will be exploited by ICE, which is the same agency that exploited gang databases in the past unless city agencies stopped using it. In some instances, facial recognition technologies have been 95% inaccurate and have misidentified members of the Black and non-white communities, resulting in unjust arrests. Knowing this, we are extremely concerned about the exacerbation of discriminatory policing practices, including the prevention of free and safe exercise of peaceful assembly and the expansion of tools of mass surveillance. So today we join with our allies to call on NYPD to provide more detailed information to the public. At a minimum, they must provide vendor names, device models, details on how information is shared, and details on how it's retained. We cannot allow police use of surveillance tech to proliferate. We will continue to advocate for the rights of all New Yorkers and continue to seek out information to ensure transparency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. Next, we're going to be hearing from Derek Perkinson of the National Action Network.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here, I'm outside, so excuse the noise. I'm representing the National Action Network on behalf of Reverend Dr. Al Sharpton, civil rights organization started 30 years ago this year to provide equality for all race, genders, and nationalities, no matter your religion or gender. We only have until this Thursday to demand real accountability and transparency from the NYPD in disclosing their use of invasive surveillance technology to spy on Black and Brown New Yorkers. NYPD's draft policies shared in response to the Post Act strikingly downplay the disparate impact of surveillance technology on Black and Brown New Yorkers, as well as on other communities of color. Technologies like facial recognition are programmed with the same racial biases held by the real people who created them. To keep our communities and neighbors safe, I encourage all New Yorkers to make their voices heard by commenting on the Post Act and demanding an end to NYPD's escalating mass surveillance state. So we're calling for the urgency of submitting comments before February 25th or by February 25th. That's a couple of days away. We want to just also cite the errors and the misinformation by the NYPD when they claim facial recognition and the gang database It does not discriminate. We know that to be false. We have the data to prove that it's false. They claim facial recognition and ShotSpotter, another technology they use, do not use AI technology. We also know that is false. They also deny that any of their technology enables immigration enforcement. So we're calling on the NYPD to provide more detailed information to the public. At a minimum, they need to provide us with the vendor's name, device models, details on how information is shared, and details on how it's retained. So we thank you for this time. Reverend Dr. Al Sharpton is very passionate about this issue, and we will stay with this coalition and our counterparts to make sure if there's no justice, there'll be no peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. Next, we're going to be hearing from our last speaker, Caitlin Seeley George of Fight for the Future. Thank you so much, Caitlin.
Thanks, Albert, and good morning. Passing the Post Act was a huge step forward towards holding law enforcement accountable and reining in their out-of-control surveillance network in New York. But the NYPD's response, their unwillingness to fully comply with the law, and even in some cases, lying about how they're using these tools, is a huge problem. And it's exactly why they shouldn't be allowed to use these tools of mass surveillance at all. Tools like facial recognition are inherently biased and are being unjustly deployed on marginalized communities. And the New York Police Department claiming that their facial recognition doesn't discriminate is just blatantly untrue. And we also know, as others have mentioned, that the police used facial recognition to identify people who attended protests against racism in law enforcement last summer. And there's absolutely no reason to think that they aren't using this technology in other unjust ways. These actions just prove that the NYPD should not have access to these mass surveillance tools because they misuse them to oppress Black, Brown, and immigrant communities. So it's really critical that New Yorkers make sure to submit comments on the draft policies, as others have said, before the deadline this Thursday, the 25th. And it's really incredibly important that everyone continue to engage on these issues as we use the information gathered, or the lack of information gathered through this process, to ban the use of these dangerous surveillance technologies like facial recognition. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I would now invite members of the press to submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for any of the panelists on the topics that have been raised. And I know that in Zoom land, there can sometimes be a delay. So we'll just give everyone a moment. If you have any questions, you can also submit them through the chat function if that is easier. Please feel free to submit that using whichever method you find easiest. And while we're waiting for those questions, one thing I think it's important to address that our panelists talked about, but no one has addressed it directly, which is the fact that when the NYPD refuses to comply with the Post Act, they are undermining civil rights, they're promoting discrimination, they're putting New Yorkers in harm's way, but they're also undermining democracy itself. And really, this is a challenge not just to the department's abuse of surveillance technologies, but to the ability of our elected officials and our democratic system to hold them accountable. All right, and I see that one of our panelists has a quick addition. Erica Johnson, I'll turn it over to you for a moment.
I just wanted to add that on the eve of this Black History Month, the family of Malcolm X got a deathbed confession that the FBI and that intimated that the FBI and the NYPD colluded to assassinate Malcolm X. So we know the history of a lot of our leaders in previous times, civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King, that have been, and COINTELPRO, the Black Panthers, that have been infiltrated by the FBI, and how that plays out in history. And this is one of the major points where we can have a chance to stop the NYPD from having this unsolicited power against our Black and Brown people. And I don't think people realize the impact of what of what is happening right now. Even Joe Biden just signed an executive order saying that he's going to demilitarize the police. And that was one of the requests that people were fighting for over the summer, to demilitarize the local police departments and force, because I think people forget that these are communities that these police are working in, Black and brown communities. They're there to serve and protect everybody else. But if that trust isn't there, how can we as people, after we've seen what happened to George Floyd, after we've seen what happened to Freddie Gray, how can we trust that the police aren't using this information, these technologies against us, when we know, in fact, that they are? It is very important that these people, that you, the people of New York, who this bill is supposed to protect, especially Black and brown people, enter in that comment period to make sure that you have the correct protections for yourself and for the people that come after you and for your children. We want to build a better community. We don't want to get rid of the police. We want to have a better community relationship with the police. And one of those ways is understanding the technology that they're using to surveil Black and brown people. I just wanted to add that to that.
Well, thank you so much for that, Erica. I think that is an incredibly important and powerful point at which to end on for today's press conference. Not seeing any other questions, I think we'll end things there, but really grateful for everyone who participated today, and really grateful to the thousands of New Yorkers who have reached out as part of this process. Thank you so much, everyone. Please stay safe.